Welcome back, Summit County. I'm Dave Rossi, Communications Director for Summit County Government. I am with two commissioners today, Tamara Pogue and Josh Blanchard. We're going to talk today a little bit about our, what are we talking about today?
Lots of things. The legislature.
Let's start with the missing middle conversation. Yeah. We packed the room. Mm-hmm. You packed the room at the Senior Center back in February with members from anywhere from Jason Dietz, our housing director, yourself. You moderated the panel, but we had a lot of people from industry and from the state. Mm-hmm. This was a real full agenda. So what was the rundown? What was the takeaway?
Yeah. There's a lot of conversations around the state right now regarding housing, and I think one of the ones that's really bubbling to the top at the moment is that in the terms of the state's housing crisis, we're certainly seeing a struggle at lower income levels with not enough housing, but we're also increasingly seeing that struggle in a way that is traditional in Summit County, where it's much more of our middle income folks. And by middle income, I mean our teachers, our nurses, our first responders, all of us around the table today. And so the goal of the panel was really to talk about what are the elements that come into play in trying to resolve some of that crisis by building more supply. I think most folks who are engaged deeply in this housing conversation understand that at the bare minimum, the issue here is just a lack of supply. And so while there's lots of strategies we need to engage, like preserving and protecting what we have, we also need to focus on how do we build more supply more quickly across the state. And so the conversation was really focused on that. And we had a developer there, some representatives from the governor's office. We had a few folks from the state agencies that most interact in this landscape. And we talked about financing, certainly, how do you pay for these projects? But we also talked about some of the elements underneath the projects, like land use, like density, right? A conversation that we're all a little afraid to have, but is very, very important. And so we were really exploring what are all the options and opportunities available to Summit County. What does Summit County do really well? And what more do we need to have fall into place for us to really move the needle in a meaningful way?
So what's next?
Well, it's interesting because I think so many of the topics that came out of that panel are the kinds of conversations that we're having in the legislature this session. The governor in his State of the State address identified housing as a matter of statewide concern, where traditionally housing has been viewed more in this planning element, which is traditionally the responsibility of counties and municipalities. But the governor, and I support the governor in this, recognizes that housing is really a statewide economic issue. If we don't find a way to house our workforce across the state, it's going to have pretty significant economic impacts, in addition to the very personal impacts that we see in communities like ours and for our residents. So he's very focused on this conversation, which I appreciate, and giving counties and municipalities more tools to move the needle, changing some of the way we do planning as counties and municipalities, as well as making sure that there is enough funding to support some of these projects. That's obviously an ongoing conversation in the legislature, and that the funding that's available is really available to counties across the state, not just on the Front Range. Traditionally, those of us in rural resort communities have struggled because the income level caps that the state sets on the funding that they provide to us or that we can apply for is too low for most Summit County residents. We've seen that recently with Breckenridge struggling to fill Alta Verde, which is a very low income housing project. So a lot of these conversations are happening, right? The land use conversation is happening. There's continued conversation around funding for housing. And there's a lot of conversations about insurance as well in the housing space. One of the fears that keeps me up at night is what happens if our community were to have a wildfire? How do we rebuild an environment where we don't have enough housing supply, where construction costs are incredibly expensive, and where we know that traditionally we've had a lot of folks in Summit County be underinsured. That was one of the challenges they found in rebuilding in both the Boulder Lewis Hill Marshall fire as well as the troublesome fire in Grand County. So there's some bills this session that also look at that and how we provide more safety nets for communities like ours. So a lot going on in this space in a lot of different ways. And then there's all kinds of other conversations happening in the legislature at the moment beyond housing. But housing, I think the missing middle really did tie into a lot of what the legislature and the governor are talking about right now.
Right. And speaking of the state legislature, you are on the Middle Income Housing Authority, MIHA. and that's an important state agency, which has also given you a lot of I guess leadership on housing. You've been taking the lead with the other two commissioners on helping us move forward. Tell me about what's going on at the state level. What is on deck? And as you mentioned, rural resort communities are very different from the Front Range. They have tons of land. We're very land constrained. The income information that you mentioned. Tell me what, let's say, Proposition 123, maybe some other bills that you've been focusing on as a commission might impact us.
Yeah. So Proposition 123 is great from the perspective of it adds more money in this housing space. And certainly when you're talking about construction, you need more money. The challenge is the folks that drafted Proposition 123 weren't as thoughtful as I would have liked in terms of setting those AMI limits. And so there's a lot of conversations right now about what do we do about that, right? How do we make sure that rural resort communities can access those funds? So I expect we'll see legislation to try and adjust some of those things in the near future. So that's certainly a big conversation. The Middle Income Housing Authority is what I would call a new strategy to try and provide more support to developers that are building housing in that middle income space. You know, one of the most powerful tools that government can make available to developers are tax credits, right? And so the Middle Income Housing Authority looks at what other financing structures we might be able to leverage in addition to providing tax credits to make it easier to build middle income housing. So there's certainly a conversation around that. And those are, I think, the two financing conversations. The rest, as I've already talked about, are more land use and density and some of those issues.
You've brought up a lot of our housing projects in the past. So there's always a lot of moving parts here that we continue to work on several fronts and several projects. So thank you very much for that update from your lane. Speaking of lanes, Josh, sustainability has been your lane. You've been really taking the lead on pay as you throw, our landfill. Just to kind of set the stage here, our landfill is running out of room. There's a predicted end date, and I think it is the community's imperative to slow that down. So one of the things we have going on is pay as you throw. We'll talk about that in a second, but a really interesting concept has come up. When you guys visited Aspen, you went to Pitkin County's landfill. They talked to you about construction and demolition. Tell us about that.
Sure. And again, this is a community-wide issue. I think that that's something that's really important. When we talk about the strategies of preserving the life of our landfill, it really needs to come from the entire community. Construction and demolition programs have been successful in Pitkin, in Boulder, and other different sized communities. And what it really does is it creates programs, both incentive programs as well as maybe restrictions, that disallow certain types of construction materials or demolition materials to go back into the landfill. In Summit County, about a third of what is being put into the landfill is actually coming from some of these construction and demolition sites. We know, living in a resort community, that there is a churn. We're constantly in development. We're in redevelopment. So sometimes we're tearing down old structures and building new structures in their place. And so this is an ongoing challenge. And this potential program could give us an opportunity to really stop some of that from happening, to preserve the landfill, to your point, but it also supports our sustainability goals in terms of reusing materials that have a longer lifespan, and just doing better with the materials and the resources that we have.
Great. So when you're talking about that 1/3 of materials, we're talking what?
We're talking concrete. We're talking different types of scrap metal. We're talking cardboard. All of the kinds of things that you see at a construction site that's typically just loose materials. They get thrown in those big roll-offs and taken to the landfill and just dumped. Tons and tons of these types of materials every day.
So the consultant that came in that is working with our scrap folks and the commission is recommending a pilot program to begin now to explore ways to start to bring this down, and then by 2027 to have this fully operational. It sounds like right now in Summit County we're not exactly like Pitkin in that Pitkin's doing tons of redevelopment, so they are scraping buildings, so there's a lot of materials. We're not quite there yet, or are we? Tell me about what's different about just building a new house versus scraping something off, and what that means for a landfill.
Well, there's a couple of things. First of all, Pitkin is different because they're really looking at just two municipalities with Aspen and Pitkin County. We know that we have Summit County, plus we have a variety. We have all of our incorporated towns. And so when we think about the partnership piece and the collaboration piece, we really need to look at this with our community partners so that it is a comprehensive program. The other thing, though, is, to your point, the different types of materials that are used, the volume of those materials that are being used. We don't necessarily have these 100,000 square foot, malls or hospitals that are being demoed, that are developing these, are creating tons and tons of concrete. It is smaller projects. And so when we think about creating a program that's going to work for Summit County, we really need to think about how can we do the best for some of these smaller projects. Maybe it's just a condo complex or a single multifamily home. Maybe it's some commercial redevelopment, that's getting a facelift. And so I think that's, to your point, where as we work to craft this, as we look at developing a pilot program for this year, we really need to think about those characteristics in Summit County.
Great. And so with Pay As You Throw, which is a program that Breckenridge and Frisco are launching this fall or beginning this spring, with a plan to get really up and going by the fall, and the county is exploring following that their launch with another launch after we kind of work out some kinks, or we see how that's working for the towns of Breckenridge and Frisco. This will also contribute to lessening the amount of waste that is going into the landfill, right?
Yeah. So Summit County, of course, we've been talking about Pay As You Throw for a couple of, almost 2 years, actually. And this is a program that, of course, the goal is to increase conversion with recycling materials or recyclable materials. And again, keeping some of those, some of that waste out of the landfill. What has been, I think, a priority for this BOCC and a challenge for this BOCC is the unincorporated landscape of Summit County has very diverse community needs, right?
Yep.
We have aging infrastructure, old homes where there's lots of, folks in one property. Many of the maybe lower income or working class communities exist in unincorporated Summit County. So we've been very thoughtful in terms of, making sure that a program isn't punitive to folks that have larger families or might, generate more trash. And so we've really wanted to get into the details for that. And look at the data and really see how rolling out a program in Breckenridge and Frisco can work, can meet those goals, but at the same time support, our families and our working individuals. And so we're excited that we're sort of moving forward with that in a thoughtful sort of way. And to your point, it's likely to be sort of maybe the phase 2 of what's to come behind Breckenridge and Frisco.
Great. So we'll be looking forward to finalizing those programs here in the next couple weeks. I just want to shout out to both you guys and to Aaron Byrne, our director of the scrap. You guys have approved and seen through a lot of upgrades at the scrap, which some of them are going online. We'll be doing a little celebration of a new gatehouse and a materials recycling facility there. But Aaron just announced that in a 4-state region, I think it is, that the bales of recycling, they are the cleanest of any program in this 4-state region. And it's not just, hey, you're really neat, but it saves the county money. It saves taxpayers money. I believe it's 20% less cost when you have the kind of bales that Aaron has been working to ensure remain clean. So shout out to you guys, certainly to Aaron and his team over at the scrap for helping taxpayers and us save a little bit of money on our recycling program.
Well, and shout out to the community, right? I mean, the folks who are recycling, it's challenging up here. Part of that too is just keeping the materials dry. We know that's a challenge. And Aaron and his team do an exceptional job of really thinking thinking this through. And so for everyone who's engaged in the different recycling programs, thank you. And it's never too late to sign up for programs or to learn where the recycling centers are, to learn where drop-off points are for glass, for example. So encourage folks to learn more about our progress with C&D by going to our website. You can also visit with our partners at High Country Conservation Center. They have a lot of the education materials around these recycling programs.
Yeah, we'll be looking forward to that. If you're interested in learning more about our recycling programs and sustainability efforts, please visit us at summitcountyco.gov, and we'll talk to you real soon. Thanks.